"Give me in here," said the Duke of Coldmere, without looking up from the contract on the desk between them, "and you are free to go. That is the whole of my offer. I will not pretend it is more romantic than it is." Isolde Mercer sat very straight in the hard chair across the great cold desk and did not let her face change, though something in her chest contracted at the flat, businesslike cruelty of it. She had known, coming here, that the Duke of Coldmere was not a warm man. The whole of the county knew it. What she had not known was that he would lay it out so plainly, her future, her body, her freedom, as though he were buying a horse and naming the terms of its eventual sale. "You will forgive me, Your Grace," she said, and was proud that her voice came out level, "if I observe that you have not yet looked at me once since I entered this room." That made him look up. Oswin, Duke of Coldmere, raised his dark eyes from the contract and regarded the woman his man of business had recommended, an impoverished lady of good blood and no fortune, the daughter of a baron who had gambled away an estate and left his children proud and penniless. He had expected someone meek. He had expected gratitude or fear, or the brittle false brightness of a woman selling herself and pretending otherwise. He had not expected the cool, faintly amused challenge in the grey eyes that met his now, nor the very slight lift of one dark brow, as though she had caught him in a small rudeness and meant him to know it. "I beg your pardon," he said after a moment. "You are quite right. I have been ungracious." "You have been businesslike," she corrected, "which I prefer to false grace. I only wished to be looked at before I was bargained for. It is a small vanity. I find I have very few left, and I should like to keep that one." He studied her. She was not a beauty by the standards of the drawing rooms. She was too tall, her features too decided, her gown 2 seasons out of fashion, and mended at the cuff with care. But she sat in his cold study as though it were her own, and she met his eyes without flinching, and there was something in the set of her mouth that suggested a great deal held quietly in reserve. He found, against all his expectation and very much against his will, that he was interested. "You understand the terms," he said, returning to safer ground. "I require an heir. The title and the estate must not pass to my cousin, whom I will not name in detail except to say that he would ruin in 5 years what has stood for 300. I have no wish for a wife in any sense beyond that necessity. I do not want companionship. I do not want affection." The word came out with faint distaste, as though it described an illness. "I will give you a settlement that will keep you in comfort and independence for the rest of your life. Once there is an heir, you may live where you please as you please. We need scarcely meet again." "How generous," said Isolde, "to promise me your absence as the chief reward." He was silent a moment. "You have a sharp tongue." "I have a sharp tongue and an empty purse, Your Grace, and I have learned that the one is the only consolation for the other. If you find it disagreeable, I am sure your cousin's eventual duchess will be more soothing." She rose, smoothing her worn skirts. "I will give you my answer in the morning. I should like to sleep on the sale of my entire future, if it is all the same to you. It seems a thing one ought not to decide before dinner." She curtsied, exactly as deep as courtesy required and not 1 degree deeper, and left him alone in his cold study with the contract and the unfamiliar sensation of having been, somehow, bested. She accepted in the morning. Of course she accepted. She had a younger sister to keep and no other means under heaven of keeping her, and the Duke's settlement would see the girl raised and dowered and safe. Isolde told herself, signing her name beneath his on the cold document, that she felt nothing. She had decided long ago that feeling was a luxury for women with money, and she had none. They were married in the great chill chapel of Coldmere within the month, with only the household and the law to witness it, and the Duke spoke his vows in a flat even voice and did not look at her, and Isolde spoke hers in a flat even voice and looked at him the whole time, because she had promised herself she would not be the one to look away. What neither of them had reckoned on was the house. Coldmere was vast and cold and beautiful, and it was, Isolde discovered, dying by inches. The Duke kept to his library and his accounts and the management of his lands, and the rest of the great house had been allowed to fall into a sort of grand neglect, covered furniture, shut rooms, a skeleton of servants who crept about in the silence as though afraid to wake something. It was the house of a man who had decided, long before Isolde came, that he did not deserve warmth and would not seek it. She could not bear it. It was not in her nature to sit idle in cold rooms and wait to perform her single function. Within a fortnight she had the holland covers off the morning room and a fire lit in a grate that had not seen one in years. She found the still room and set it working. She walked the half-walled gardens and gave the gardener leave, in the Duke's name, to bring the roses back. She did these things quietly, expecting opposition, and when none came, when the Duke said nothing at all, only watched from a distance the slow rewarming of his house, she did more. Oswin watched her with a wariness that deepened, week on week, into something he had no name for and did not want. He had built his whole life on the principle that warmth was dangerous. He had learned it early and learned it hard. He did not examine the lesson, only abide it. He had married a stranger precisely because a stranger could be kept at the cold distance he required. And now the stranger had thrown open the morning room and filled it with firelight, and had taken to dining at the far end of his long table and conducting, across 40 feet of polished mahogany, a running commentary on his estate, his neighbours, and his own deficiencies, delivered in a dry voice that made him want, against every instinct he possessed, to laugh. He did not laugh. He had not laughed in years, but he found himself coming to dinner. "You needn't look so grim," she told him one evening down the length of the table, the candlelight between them and the firelight at her back. "I am not trying to make you love me, Your Grace. I am aware that was struck from the contract. I am only trying to make this house fit to live in, because I find I cannot perform any function at all, including the one you married me for, while shivering in covered rooms among ghosts. Warmth is a practical necessity. Pray regard it as such, if affection alarms you." "It does not alarm me," he said too quickly. "It terrifies you," said Isolde, and drank her wine. "I have watched you flinch from a kind word the way other men flinch from a blow. Someone taught you that warmth would cost you, and you have believed it so long you have built a whole cold house to prove it. I am sorry for whoever taught you. I am sorrier still that you went on being his pupil long after he was gone." The Duke set down his glass very carefully, and for a long moment Isolde thought she had gone too far at last. Then he said, in a low voice she had not heard from him before, stripped of all its flat command, "My father. It was my father." He held that any softness was a crack through which the world would come in and take what you loved. He was proven right in his way. "My mother loathed me, and he saw it, and he sent me from her, and he stopped. I have not spoken of this in 20 years. Then it was past time," said Isolde gently, and the dryness had gone out of her voice. "Your father was a fool and a coward, Your Grace, and I will say so though he is dead and a duke. To be loved is not a crack the world comes in through. It is the only thing that keeps the cold out at all. I should know. I have been very cold and very poor, and the one thing that kept me upright was that there was a person in the world I loved enough to stay upright for." He looked at her down the length of his table, the firelight at her back and the candlelight on her decided, unlovely, extraordinary face, and the Duke of Coldmere understood, with a sensation very like falling, that the lesson of his whole life had been wrong, and that he had married, by cold accident, the one woman in England capable of teaching him so. He began to court his own wife. He did it badly at first, being entirely out of practice. He had the roses she had revived cut and brought to her rooms, and then could not think what to say about them, and so said nothing, and left them on the table like a confession he could not finish. He came to the warm morning room in the evenings with his accounts under his arm, and sat across from her by the fire and did not work, and she let him not work, and they spoke of small things, and the small things became, over weeks, the whole texture of his days. He found her sister's letters being read aloud by the fire, and learned the girl's name and asked after her, and saw Isolde's face change when he did, saw her notice that he had noticed, and felt that small change in her, as though it had happened in his own chest. The cold bargain, struck across the great desk, lay unspoken between them all that while, like a thing they were both ashamed of. Neither raised it. The terms were plain, and Heir, then her freedom, then his absence as her reward. But the terms had been drawn between two strangers, and they were strangers no longer, and every warm evening by the morning room fire made the cold contract read more like a cruelty and less like a bargain. It was Isolde, in the end, who said it, because she had always been the braver of the two. "You have not come to me," she said one night, quietly, by the fire, not looking at him. "We have been wed 3 months, and you have not the hair, your grace. The one thing you bargained for, you have not pressed it. I confess I do not understand you." The Duke was silent a long moment. "Because," he said at last, low, "the bargain I struck was a monstrous thing, and I did not understand how monstrous until I came to value the woman I struck it with. I cannot come to you as a term of a contract, Isolde. I find the very thought of it unbearable. You are not a function. You are not a means by which my cousin is kept from the title. You are—" He stopped and made himself go on, 'cause he had been a coward his whole life and had decided, watching her revive his dying house, that he would be a coward no longer. "You are the warmth I was taught to fear, and I am done being afraid. I do not want an Heir bargained for across a desk. I want a wife and a home and the long ordinary warmth of years, and I want them with you, and only you, not because of any contract, but because I have fallen, wholly, and against every rule I ever made, in love with you. Tear up the contract. I should rather have you freely, or not at all, than ever again as a term." Isolde turned from the fire and looked at him, and her grey eyes were bright, and the dry armour she had worn since the day she walked into his cold study had fallen entirely away. "You stubborn, frozen, foolish man," she said, and her voice was unsteady. "I tore up the contract in my heart weeks ago. I have been sitting by your fire every evening loving you and telling myself it was practical warmth, and despising myself for the lie, and waiting for you to thaw enough to say a true word. And now you have said it, and I find I have a great many true words saved up, and the first of them is that I never wanted my freedom, Oswin. I wanted you, from the day you would not look at me, and then did. I wanted the man under all that cold, and I have got him, and I will not be giving him back." He crossed the warm room to her, and took her face in both his hands, the first time he had touched her with any tenderness at all, and for a long moment the Duke of Coldmere simply looked at his wife, as he had failed to do across the desk, and looked, as though making up for every glance he had denied himself. Then he bent his head to hers, and the firelight burned low, and the warm room held them, and the rest belonged to no one but themselves. They were not strangers after that, in any sense. Coldmere ceased, that winter, to be a cold house. The covers came off the last shut rooms. The skeleton servants grew into a household, and the household grew accustomed to the sound of the Duchess's laugh in the morning room, and eventually to the more astonishing sound of the Duke's, low and rusty and rare and real. Isolde's sister came to live with them, and filled the long gallery with the racket of a young person who has never been taught to be afraid, and Oswin, who had been sent from his own mother for the crime of being loved, found that he could not pass the girl in a corridor without being glad, fiercely and bewilderingly glad, that the house was loud. In the fullness of time, and it was a warm, ordinary, blessed fullness, the kind Oswin had been taught he did not deserve, and had decided by then to deserve anyway, there came a season when Isolde grew quiet and content, and kept to the warm rooms, and the household began to ready a long-shut nursery wing, and the gardener was asked to keep the morning room always in roses. The cousin, who would have ruined the estate, received a cool and final letter, and was heard from no more. The Duke of Coldmere stood at the morning-room window one evening of that season, watching the early dark come down over the gardens his wife had brought back to life, and Isolde came and stood beside him and slipped her hand into his, and they looked out together at the roses going to shadow. "I offered you and Heir your freedom," he said quietly, across a desk, without looking at you. "I have been ashamed of it every day since I came to love you. It was the coldest thing I ever did, and it brought me the only warmth I have ever known, and I do not know what to do with a debt like that except to spend my whole life paying it." "Then pay it as you have been," said Isolde, leaning into his shoulder, "with roses you cannot find words for, and accounts you do not work on, and your laugh in the morning room, and your hand in mine at the window in the dark. I struck a bargain to be free of you, Oswin. It is the best bad bargain a poor woman ever made, for it bound me to the one man I would have chosen freely out of all the cold world, had the world ever thought to ask me." She turned her face up to his. "You were never the cold one, you were only the frozen one. And I have thawed you, and I find I like very much what was underneath." "Stay," he said, very low, the word that had once meant a contract, and meant now the whole of his heart. "Not for an Heir, not for any term, only because the house is warm when you are in it, and unbearable when you are not. Stay, Isolde, all the long ordinary years, and let me look at you every single day, and let me make up for the one time I forgot to." "I am not going anywhere," she said, and lifted his hand and kissed the wedding band she had put upon it, the cold gold gone warm now from his skin. "There is no freedom I want that is anywhere but here. You may look at me, Oswin, every day you are given, for I never wanted the door you offered to open. I only ever wanted the man who, in the end, could not bring himself to push me through it." And the Duke of Coldmere, who had built a cold house to keep the world from taking what he loved, drew his wife into the warm circle of his arms and held her at the window in the falling dark, and was no longer afraid of anything at all.